agricultural products with modern infrastructures and integrated logistics services. By investing in local manufacturing, we ultimately seek to replace foreign imports with domestic production. In all our endeavors, we are driven by the pursuit of green, sustainable growth, one that can last for generations to come. We are the pioneer of a green, responsible industrialization, one that ensures gender diversity, sustainability, traceability, and a zero-waste policy. This is why we create innovative solutions that support a climate-conscious economic development in Africa. This starts with neutralizing carbon emissions and creating a positive environmental legacy. By 2022, all of Arise IIP's industrial zones will be carbon neutral, powered fully by solar technology. This is all made possible by the dedication and commitment of the women and men who work at Arise. Together, we are on a journey to build an African industry, a journey to create a better, more resilient, sustainable, and inclusive future for everyone. Arise IIP, committed to making Africa thrive.
Dans ce contexte actuel de crise sanitaire mondiale liée à la pandémie de la COVID-19, il s'avère fondamental de relever la participation des femmes dans tous les maillons de la production, d'encourager et de renforcer leur leadership et leur résilience pour favoriser leur autonomisation, surtout dans le domaine économique. TechnoServe Bénin et l'Agence territoriale de développement agricole Pôle 4 s'inscrivent activement dans cette dynamique. À cet effet, le 15 et 16 octobre 2020, s'est tenue dans la salle de conférence de l'ATDA Pôle 4 à Parakou une cérémonie de célébration de la Journée internationale de la femme rurale édition 2020. Cette journée a pour objectif de définir les modalités de mise en œuvre d'une stratégie de renforcement du leadership et d'une résilience plus accrue des femmes dans les différentes activités de développement socio-économique.
Dans la plupart des décisions, ces femmes-là ne bénéficient pas des avantages qui sont liés au développement économique de chaque pays. Donc, pour les valoriser davantage, la communauté internationale a dédié la journée du 15 octobre pour les célébrer. Comme nous sommes en partenariat avec des programmes, ils ont décidé de nous accompagner pour pouvoir célébrer l'événement au niveau local. Ces femmes-là sont aussi présentes surtout au niveau du maillon transformation. C'est pourquoi nous leur avons demandé de ne pas venir seulement pour écouter les discours, mais qu'elles viennent avec leur chef-d'œuvre pour qu'on puisse voir ce qu'elles font et les gens vont aussi profiter pour se ravitailler.
En effet, dans sa stratégie de renforcement des capacités des acteurs de la filière cajou, TechnoServe a, à travers Bénin Cajou, fourni des assistances techniques spécifiques et appropriées à la satisfaction des besoins des partenaires du public et du privé afin de promouvoir la production des noix brutes d'anacarde, le développement des chaînes de valeur et l'amélioration des revenus, notamment ceux des femmes.
Les braves femmes rurales sont effectivement à l'honneur aujourd'hui. Nous les félicitons et nous les exhortons à mettre leur résilience au service de nos communautés, surtout en cette période de pandémie. Et nous voulons les rassurer du soutien de TechnoServe pour une plus grande intégration du genre dans les chaînes de valeur de la filière anacarde.
Rappelons qu'au cours de cette messe agricole et rurale de haute facture, diverses autorités ont accompagné l'ATDA et TechnoServe à accélérer les meilleures innovations des produits dérivés du cajou et renforcer les aptitudes des femmes leaders et résilientes dans la filière cajou. Aussi faut-il le souligner, l'ambiance a été motivante et festive, marquée par 2 temps forts, portant notamment sur les réflexions et les partages d'expériences sur la résilience des femmes dans la chaîne de valeur anacarde et l'exposition vente des meilleures innovations réussies en faveur des femmes dans le développement socio-économique.
C'est grâce à Bénin Cajou que ça a été organisé dans le Nord, précisément à Parakou, et ça a permis aux femmes des deux nord de participer. Je veux dire, Takora Donga, Borgo, Algori, Zoukoline, le centre aussi. Voilà pourquoi je tiens à remercier très sincèrement Bénin Cashew. Et cette séance aujourd'hui nous permet, elle nous a permis de partager les expériences des autres femmes. C'est déjà un plus pour nous. Et pour nous qui sommes arrivés, je nous demande à notre retour de passer l'information à celles qui ne sont pas venues pour qu'elles puissent aussi être informées de ce que nous sommes venus faire. C'est ce qui manque souvent. Et ça fait que les informations, nous les gardons et les autres n'ont plus d'informations aussi. Ça ne permet pas un développement du groupe. Donc je nous demande de souvent communiquer, de partager l'information avec les autres femmes aussi de nos groupes.
Notons que dans la vision de travailler pour une véritable accélération et intégration de la filière Cashew au Bénin, avec une part conséquente pour les femmes, l'intégration du genre constitue l'un des principaux axes d'intervention de Technoserve via le projet Bénin Cashew.
Le projet Bénin Cashew a inscrit dans ses priorités, à compter de l'année 2019, des activités pour la sensibilisation des acteurs en vue d'une meilleure prise en compte de l'intégration du genre dans les différents maillons de la production. C'est à ce titre qu'après avoir milité en amont par un plaidoyer auprès de la FENAPAB pour l'amendement des textes en faveur d'une plus grande intégration du genre, Bénin Cashew a soutenu en aval le processus de renouvellement des organes de gestion de la FENAPAB, qui s'est achevé le 23 septembre 2019 avec l'élection à sa tête d'une femme, Madame Saadatou Atta Kakayachi, en tant que présidente du conseil d'administration.
Après mon élection à la FENAPAB, les impressions sont bonnes. Surtout être à la tête d'une fédération nationale des producteurs d'anacarde du Bénin. Les points clés de mes actions sont relatifs à la recherche des partenaires pour améliorer la qualité de nos activités, développer le plaidoyer à l'endroit de l'État pour qu'il nous accompagne.
Mariée et mère de 3 enfants, Madame Saadatou est propriétaire de 5 plantations d'anacardiers de 7 hectares et demi à Pénésoulou dans la commune de Bassila, à 372 km de Cotonou. Entrée dans la production du cajou depuis 1998 et précédemment chef quartier, cette mère dévouée gère en subsidiaire son restaurant, son commerce de savon et mène des œuvres sociales en faveur des orphelins de son arrondissement. Brave et vaillante, elle exhorte son équipe et les femmes dans la filière cajou à se battre pour pousser loin la filière.
Pour réussir ma mission, c'est un engagement efficace de l'équipe. Ensuite aussi, il y a la disponibilité que toutes les femmes adhèrent aux coopératives de leur localité, entretenir bien les champs disponibles, celles qui n'en ont pas encore n'ont qu'à produire et surtout faire la vente groupée.
Le directeur général de la Fédération nationale des producteurs d'anacarde du Bénin, FENAPAB, explique ici les raisons qui ont soutenu cette action d'éclat manifestée par l'élection d'une femme à la présidence du conseil d'administration de la FENAPAB.
Depuis la création de la FENAPAB en 2006, elle a été gérée par les hommes. Déjà en septembre 2019, les hommes et les femmes ont souhaité mettre maintenant les femmes à la tête de cette organisation pour gérer ces 2 organes-là, conseil d'administration et conseil de surveillance.
La commune de Bassila n'est pas restée en marge de ce processus car la mairie s'est illustrée récemment dans des actes forts en faveur des femmes pour la filière cajou.
Il faut dire que c'est un honneur pour nous et une fierté de savoir que une dame de ma commune, à la personne de Madame Atta Kakayachi Sada, a été élue. C'est en même temps un défi pour nous.
Avec ce coup d'éclat, Madame Atta, présidente de la FENAPAB, élue pour 3 ans depuis le 23 septembre 2019, expose ici succinctement un plan de sa vision pour la filière cajou qui ne peut évidemment pas se réaliser sans le précieux concours des autorités en charge de l'agriculture au Bénin.
Actuellement, nous sommes à 130 000 tonnes. Mon souhait est qu'on fasse le double, sinon même pourquoi pas le triple du tonnage antérieur et ensuite qu'on puisse transformer plus de la moitié de ces produits au niveau local chez nous pour le plein essor de cette filière. Les activités à mener, c'est de continuer le plaidoyer envers le public, les privés, dans le renforcement des capacités.
Cashew is an increasingly important crop for the countries in West Africa. For Benin, it's their second most valuable export. And we saw this big potential to grow and increase more.
Le cajou arrive en seconde place après le coton. À 110 000, 120 000 tonnes, en 2 ans, nous sommes passés à 120, 130, 140 000 tonnes. L'objectif du gouvernement, c'est d'aller à 300 000 tonnes à la fin du quinquennat.
Cashew me permet de vivre. Au moment où je n'avais pas suivi avec Cashew Bénin les deux. Deux hectares font 5 sacs. Et maintenant, avec Cashew Bénin, je vends 15 sacs cette année. Le projet nous a appris beaucoup de choses.
Il a formé 10 personnes, dont 9 femmes et 1 homme.
Après mon élection à la FENAPAB, les impressions sont bonnes. Surtout être à la tête d'une fédération nationale des producteurs d'anacarde du Bénin. Les points clés de mes actions sont relatifs à la recherche des partenaires pour améliorer la qualité de nos activités, développer le plaidoyer à l'endroit de l'État pour qu'il nous accompagne.
Benin Cashew is an innovative program aimed at strengthening and growing the Beninese cashew sector. Its goal is to create a more productive, competitive, sustainable, and it's being funded by the USDA and is being implemented by TechnoServe and our partners at CRS. Over 8 years, Benin Cashew will increase the yields and incomes of more than 49,000 smallholder farmers, triple Benin's domestic processing capacity, create more than 3,400 jobs, most of which will be held by women, and will position the entire sector for continued growth long after the project ends.
TechnoServe travaille avec des hommes et des femmes pour bâtir des fermes et des entreprises compétitives qui contribuent à la réduction de la pauvreté, à l'augmentation de la résilience des bénéficiaires et de leur communauté. Nous restons convaincus que la participation pleine et entière des femmes et des filles permet de maximiser la croissance économique inclusive pour un développement généralisé. Au sein de la production agricole et notamment dans la filière cajou, bien que présente, les femmes sont confrontées à des difficultés en ce qui concerne l'accès aux facteurs de production, notamment la terre, les ressources financières, la technologie et les formations. Au début du projet Benin Cashew, la participation des femmes était d'environ 20,57%. À fin décembre 2020, ce taux est passé à 34,67% au sein de la production et à 39% au sein du projet. L'objectif est d'atteindre au moins 40% de participation des femmes. Pour atteindre ce résultat, nous avons mis en place un dispositif institutionnel avec tous les partenaires du projet pour intégrer le genre au sein de toutes les activités de ce projet. Nous avons un dispositif basé sur des points focaux genre qui ont reçu des formations sur différentes techniques, différentes thématiques. Nous avons mené aussi un plaidoyer pour la modification des tests statutaires des fêtières des producteurs de cajou afin d'alléger les conditions d'accès des femmes aux coopératives. Et nous avons qu'avoir une femme présidente du conseil d'administration de la fêtière des producteurs d'anacarde et une femme présidente du conseil de surveillance de cette même organisation, ce qui est une première au Bénin au sein de la filière anacarde.
Après mon élection à la FENAPAB, les impressions sont bonnes. Surtout être à la tête d'une fédération nationale des producteurs d'anacarde du Bénin. Les points clés de mes actions sont relatifs à la recherche des partenaires pour améliorer la qualité de nos activités, développer le plaidoyer à l'endroit de l'État pour qu'il nous accompagne.
J'ai constaté qu'avec cette formation, la femme a un grand rôle à jouer pour l'émancipation et la prospérité, bien partagée qu'à l'intérieur, qu'à l'extérieur, au sein du foyer. Grâce à cette même formation, la population, mais la communauté a un regard craintif en nous. Ils nous copient, ils voient la manière dont nous vivons avec mon épouse. Grâce à cette formation, nous avons pu réaliser beaucoup de choses.
Cette formation que nous avons eue sur le champ nous a réveillés par rapport à la femme, parce que dans le maillon production, on a constaté que les femmes n'ont pas assez à la tête, donc du coup, elles sont marginalisées. Donc sur le terrain, nous voyons à ce que les femmes sont prises en compte. Et comme le projet le recommande 40% de femmes, il faut dire que ce n'est pas facile. 40% des femmes dans tout ce que nous faisons, on doit pouvoir toucher au moins 40% de femmes.
Africa. A continent thriving with opportunities. 70% of the world's cocoa, 53% of the world's cashew. The resource-rich continent is at a turning point. By 2030, Africa will be home to 20% of the world's population and 75% of people aged under 35. Yet, across the continent, some dynamics persist. The continent continues to export raw natural resources at low cost. Meanwhile, the resilience of its economies is tested by unemployment, poverty, and a global pandemic. Despite the challenges, together we can unlock this potential. At Arise IIP, our vision is to build an African industry. Our ambition is to shift Africa from a global commodity supplier to a global manufacturing powerhouse. We do this by identifying industrial gaps in African countries. We then design tailor-made infrastructure and solutions to enable the sustainable and local transformation of raw materials. In Gabon, where 85% of the land is covered by dense and pristine rainforest, we created from scratch a vibrant local timber industry. It did not happen overnight. We brought together local timber industry players and attracted foreign investors to create a competitive timber processing ecosystem. For this ecosystem to flourish, we attracted foreign investors, establishing linkages across the whole value chain, organizing trade shows for hosted companies to showcase and market their timber products, and boosting exports. GSE's Wood Cluster is now composed of 90 companies operating from the first to the third transformation of timber. All of them transforming ethically and sustainably sourced Gabonese wood. In less than 10 years, Gabon shifted from a net log exporter to the first exporter of veneer in Africa and second in the world. In fact, the real impact was much wider and more meaningful. With GSES, Arise IIP has created 16,000 jobs, attracted 120 investors coming from 18 different countries, operating in 19 industry sectors. In Togo, Benin, and Côte d'Ivoire, our work is underway, following the same approach. Cotton, cashew, soya, cocoa. We enable the transformation of local agricultural products with modern infrastructures and integrated logistics services. By investing in local manufacturing, we ultimately seek to replace foreign imports with domestic production. In all our endeavors, we are driven by the pursuit of green, sustainable growth, one that can last for generations to come. We are the pioneer of a green, responsible industrialization, one that ensures gender diversity, sustainability, traceability, and a zero-waste policy. This is why we create innovative solutions that support a climate-conscious economic development in Africa. This starts with neutralizing carbon emissions and creating a positive environmental legacy. By 2022, all of Arise IIP's industrial zones will be carbon neutral, powered fully by solar technology. This is all made possible by the dedication and commitment of the women and men who work at Arise. Together, we are on a journey to build an African industry, a journey to create a better, more resilient, sustainable, and inclusive future for everyone. Arise IIP, committed to making Africa thrive.
Je m'appelle Sinagero Kalilaki. J'ai 28 ans. Je suis née à Ina, dans la commune de Bembereke. Je suis mariée et nous avons 2 enfants. Quand je me réveille, je fais d'abord mes travaux domestiques. Je balaie la cour, la chambre, je lave mes bols. Je prépare le petit déjeuner pour la famille et je viens travailler en pépinière. C'est en 2019 que j'ai commencé à collaborer avec le projet Benekadio. Quand j'ai connu le projet Benekadio, on est rentré dans le système de professionnalisation. Et dans ce système, à cette date, nous avons déjà reçu 5 modules de formation. En plus de la pépinière d'Anakadi, nous faisons la pépinière des manguis et des autres essences forestières. Après ça, nous faisons les cultures vivrières telles que le soja, l'arachide, le niébé. En dehors de ça, nous faisons le levage. On fait le levage des porcs et le levage des volailles. Pendant la pandémie du Covid-19, nous n'avons pas connu de difficultés par rapport à la main-d'œuvre. La main-d'œuvre était toujours disponible. La pandémie du Covid-19 a engendré des impacts dans notre entreprise parce qu'il y a eu la baisse du prix d'achat des produits. Benekadio nous a aidés parce qu'on continuait par suivre les formations sur la professionnalisation et à chaque formation, on recevait la réponse sur le Covid-19. Après ce programme de professionnalisation qui est toujours en cours, on a appris à faire le bokashi. Le bokashi nous permet d'augmenter la production. Nous avons effectué un voyage en Tanzanie où on a appris beaucoup de choses sur l'agronomie de l'Anakadi. Mes ambitions, c'est d'abord être compté parmi les plus grands pépiniéristes du Bénin. Aller à une production de 50 000 plants. Je veux avoir également un site modèle. Nous souhaitons que Benekadio continue par nous appuyer surtout sur les aspects techniques de la production. Benekadio nous a apporté beaucoup de choses, beaucoup de connaissances. Je remercie sincèrement le projet Benekadio pour ses apports à mon niveau et de ne pas cesser de continuer toujours car on ne finit jamais d'apprendre.
relation avec l'objectif du gouvernement d'augmenter la production, qui aujourd'hui est de l'ordre de 130 000 tonnes à 300 000 tonnes d'ici les 5 prochaines années, il s'est avéré nécessaire de disposer d'un matériel végétal performant de plantation, ce qui a amené le projet Bénin Cashew à accompagner la production de ce matériel végétal performant à travers d'abord les acteurs qui sont les pépiniéristes, dont la structuration a été accompagnée, et ensuite maintenant la recherche qui aujourd'hui fait l'objet d'un accompagnement à travers l'installation de 2 sites conçus qui vont abriter les vergers de production de semences polyclonales qui puissent permettre d'atteindre l'objectif d'augmentation de la production de plants d'anacarde.
En termes d'action, Technoserve à travers Bénin Cashew a 3 axes. Le premier axe, c'est augmenter de façon quantitative les arbres mères. Ce que nous appelons arbres mères, c'est ces arbres d'anacarde qui peuvent permettre en réalité d'offrir des greffons aux pépiniéristes afin quand même d'offrir aux producteurs des plants greffés. Le deuxième axe d'intervention, c'est ces semences lax qui permet d'installer 2 vergers de production de semences polyclonales, un verger de 12 hectares à Ogui dans la commune de Savé et un verger de 12 hectares à Ina dans la commune de Bembereke. Le troisième axe d'intervention de Bénin Cashew en termes d'appui, c'est le renforcement des capacités. Et à ce titre, Technoserve a pris l'engagement d'accompagner 7 jeunes et cadres au niveau du ministère de l'Agriculture pour les envoyer en formation.
Technoserve nous a appuyés pour un voyage en Tanzanie. Et là, nous avons découvert de très merveilleuses manières de travail, telles que le greffage sur bois mou. Nous avons aussi reçu les techniques de fabrication de bokashi. Le bokashi, c'est un engrais organique. Bénin Cashew Technoserve a financé le voyage des experts d'autres pays qui sont venus nous apprendre cette technique de fabrication de bokashi.
L'Institut national de recherche agricole du Bénin a certaines faiblesses que la coopération avec Technoserve est en train de combler en termes d'infrastructures de conservation de ce matériel, en termes de ressources humaines capables de gérer convenablement ce patrimoine génétique. Nous avons déjà, avec l'appui de Technoserve, identifié des arbres élites performants d'anacardier dont nous allons utiliser les potentiels pour dupliquer et avoir beaucoup d'autres matériels. Nous avons aussi avec Technoserve le contact avec des pays comme la Tanzanie et le Mozambique qui ont de l'expérience en matière de production de cajou. Et donc on pourrait bien les rattraper.
L'importance de l'installation de ce verger est d'augmenter la quantité de matériel végétal de qualité pour permettre aux producteurs d'avoir un rendement plus élevé à l'hectare.
Nous avons aujourd'hui 3 conseillers d'entreprise qui encadrent la cinquantaine de pépiniéristes dûment identifiés, sélectionnés avec l'appui du gouvernement pour que cette production repose sur des techniques managériales, entrepreneuriales qui permettent à ces pépiniéristes de jouer un rôle prépondérant dans l'atteinte de l'objectif de l'augmentation de la production de notre pays.
Pépiniériste, nous sommes les gardiens du matériel végétal, qui est un patrimoine pour notre pays. Donc sans le pépiniériste, nos matériels végétaux performants vont disparaître. Ce que Bénin Cashew a fait pour moi, permettez-moi de le dire, ils m'ont beaucoup appuyé, surtout la formation des femmes. Donc on a eu à former 10 personnes, dont 9 femmes et un homme. Bénin Cashew est comme la levure dans la farine de blé qui fait lever le pain. J'ai pu avoir beaucoup de choses. Je me suis acheté un domaine où je suis en train de construire une maison familiale actuellement.
Et à côté, j'ai prévu une pépinière. Avant Benin Cashew, je produis 5000 plants. Je suis aujourd'hui à au moins 12 000 plants. Je vois un futur radieux devant moi.
Africa. A continent thriving with opportunities. 70% of the world's cocoa, 53% of the world's cashew. The resource-rich continent is at a turning point. By 2030, Africa will be home to 20% of the world's population and 75% of people aged under 35. Yet, across the continent, some dynamics persist. The continent continues to export raw natural resources at low cost. Meanwhile, the resilience of its economies is tested by unemployment, poverty, and a global pandemic. Despite the challenges, together we can unlock this potential. At Arise IIP, our vision is to build an African industry. Our ambition is to shift Africa from a global commodity supplier to a global manufacturing powerhouse. We do this by identifying industrial gaps in African countries. We then design tailor-made infrastructure and solutions to enable the sustainable and local transformation of raw materials. In Gabon, where 85% of the land is covered by dense and pristine rainforest, we created from scratch a vibrant local timber industry. It did not happen overnight. We brought together local timber industry players and attracted foreign investors to create a competitive timber processing ecosystem. For this ecosystem to flourish, we attracted foreign investors, establishing linkages across the whole value chain, organizing trade shows for hosted companies to showcase and market their timber products, and boosting exports. GSE's Wood Cluster is now composed of 90 companies operating from the first to the third transformation of timber. All of them transforming ethically and sustainably sourced Gabonese wood. In less than 10 years, Gabon shifted from a net log exporter to the first exporter of veneer in Africa and second in the world. In fact, the real impact was much wider and more meaningful. With GSES, Arise IIP has created 16,000 jobs, attracted 120 investors coming from 18 different countries, operating in 19 industry sectors. In Togo, Benin, and Côte d'Ivoire, our work is underway, following the same approach. Cotton, cashew, soya, cocoa. We enable the transformation of local agricultural products with modern infrastructures and integrated logistics services. By investing in local manufacturing, we ultimately seek to replace foreign imports with domestic production. In all our endeavors, we are driven by the pursuit of green, sustainable growth, one that can last for generations to come. We are the pioneer of a green, responsible industrialization, one that ensures gender diversity, sustainability, traceability, and a zero-waste policy. This is why we create innovative solutions that support a climate-conscious economic development in Africa. This starts with neutralizing carbon emissions and creating a positive environmental legacy. By 2022, all of Arise IIP's industrial zones will be carbon neutral, powered fully by solar technology. This is all made possible by the dedication and commitment of the women and men who work at Arise. Together, we are on a journey to build an African industry, a journey to create a better, more resilient, sustainable, and inclusive future for everyone. Arise IIP, committed to making Africa thrive.
Dans ce contexte actuel de crise sanitaire mondiale liée à la pandémie de la COVID-19, il s'avère fondamental de relever la participation des femmes dans tous les maillons de la production, d'encourager et de renforcer leur leadership et leur résilience pour favoriser leur autonomisation, surtout dans le domaine économique. TechnoServe Bénin et l'Agence territoriale de développement agricole Pôle 4 s'inscrivent activement dans cette dynamique. À cet effet, le 15 et 16 octobre 2020, s'est tenue dans la salle de conférence de l'ATDA Pôle 4 à Parakou une cérémonie de célébration de la Journée internationale de la femme rurale édition 2020. Cette journée a pour objectif de définir les modalités de mise en œuvre d'une stratégie de renforcement du leadership et d'une résilience plus accrue des femmes dans les différentes activités de développement socio-économique.
Dans la plupart des décisions, ces femmes-là ne bénéficient pas des avantages qui sont liés au développement économique de chaque pays. Donc, pour les valoriser davantage, la communauté internationale a dédié la journée du 15 octobre pour les célébrer. Comme nous sommes en partenariat avec des projets, programmes, ils ont décidé de nous accompagner pour pouvoir célébrer l'événement au niveau local. Ces femmes-là sont aussi présentes surtout au niveau du maillon transformation. C'est pourquoi nous leur avons demandé de ne pas venir seulement pour écouter les discours, mais qu'elles viennent avec leur chef-d'œuvre pour qu'on puisse voir ce qu'elles font et les gens vont aussi profiter pour se ravitailler.
En effet, dans sa stratégie de renforcement des capacités des acteurs de la filière cajou, TechnoServe, à travers Bénin Cajou, fournit des assistances techniques spécifiques et appropriées à la satisfaction des besoins des partenaires du public et du privé afin de promouvoir la production des noix brutes d'anacarde, le développement des chaînes de valeur et l'amélioration des revenus, notamment ceux des femmes.
Les braves femmes rurales sont effectivement à l'honneur aujourd'hui. Nous les félicitons et nous les exhortons à mettre leur résilience au service de nos communautés, surtout en cette période de pandémie. Et nous voulons les rassurer du soutien de TechnoServe pour une plus grande intégration du genre dans les chaînes de valeur de la filière anacarde.
Rappelons qu'au cours de cette messe agricole et rurale de haute facture, diverses autorités ont accompagné l'ATDA et TechnoServe à accélérer les meilleures innovations des produits dérivés du cajou et renforcer les aptitudes des femmes leaders et résilientes dans la filière cajou. Aussi faut-il le souligner, l'ambiance a été motivante et festive, marquée par 2 temps forts, portant notamment sur les réflexions et les partages d'expériences sur la résilience des femmes dans la chaîne de valeur anacarde et l'exposition vente des meilleures innovations réussies en faveur des femmes dans le développement socio-économique.
C'est grâce à Bénin Cajou que ça a été organisé dans le Nord, précisément à Parakou. Et ça a permis aux femmes des 2 Nord de participer. Je veux dire à Takora Donga, Borgo, Albori, Zoukoline, du centre aussi. Voilà pourquoi je tiens à remercier très sincèrement Bénin Cajou. Et cette séance aujourd'hui nous a permis de partager les expériences des autres femmes. C'est déjà un plus pour nous. Et pour nous qui sommes arrivés, je nous demande à notre retour de passer l'information à celles qui ne sont pas venues, pour qu'elles puissent aussi être informées de ce que nous sommes venus faire. C'est ce qui manque souvent. Et ça fait que les informations, nous les gardons et les autres n'ont plus d'informations aussi. Ça ne permet pas un développement du groupe. Donc je nous demande de souvent communiquer, de partager l'information avec les autres femmes aussi de nos groupes.
Notons que dans la vision de travailler pour une véritable accélération et intégration de la filière cajou au Bénin, avec une part conséquente pour les femmes, l'intégration du genre constitue l'un des principaux axes d'intervention de TechnoServe via le projet Bénin Cajou.
Le projet Bénin Cajou a inscrit dans ses priorités, à compter de l'année 2019, des activités pour la sensibilisation des acteurs en vue d'une meilleure prise en compte de l'intégration du genre dans les différents maillons de la production. C'est à ce titre qu'après avoir milité en amont par un plaidoyer auprès de la FENAPAB pour l'amendement des textes en faveur d'une plus grande intégration du genre, Bénin Cajou a soutenu en aval le processus de renouvellement des organes de gestion de la FENAPAB, qui s'est achevé le 23 septembre 2019 avec l'élection à sa tête d'une femme, Madame Saadatou Atta Kakayachi, en tant que présidente du conseil d'administration.
Après mon élection à la FENAPAB, les impressions sont bonnes. surtout être à la tête d'une fédération nationale des producteurs d'anacarde du Bénin. Les points clés de mes actions sont relatifs à la recherche des partenaires pour améliorer la qualité de nos activités, développer le plaidoyer à l'endroit de l'État pour qu'il nous accompagne.
Mariée et mère de 3 enfants, Madame Saadatou est propriétaire de 5 plantations d'anacardiers de 7 hectares et demi à Pénésoulou dans la commune de Bassila, à 372 km de Cotonou. Entrée dans la production du cajou depuis 1998 et précédemment chef quartier, cette mère dévouée gère en subsidiaire son restaurant, son commerce de savon et mène des œuvres sociales en faveur des orphelins de son arrondissement. Brave et vaillante, elle exhorte son équipe et les femmes dans la filière cajou à se battre pour pousser loin la filière.
Pour réussir ma mission, c'est un engagement efficace de l'équipe. Ensuite aussi, il y a la disponibilité que toutes les femmes adhèrent aux coopératives de leur localité, entretenir bien les champs disponibles, celles qui n'en ont pas encore n'ont qu'à produire et surtout faire la vente groupée.
Le directeur général de la Fédération nationale des producteurs d'anacarde du Bénin, FENAPAB, explique ici les raisons qui ont soutenu cette action d'éclat manifestée par l'élection d'une femme à la présidence du conseil d'administration de la FENAPAB.
Depuis la création de la FENAPAB en 2006, elle a été gérée par les hommes. Déjà en septembre 2019, les hommes et les femmes ont souhaité mettre maintenant les femmes à la tête de cette organisation pour gérer ces 2 organes-là, conseil d'administration et conseil de surveillance.
La commune de Bassila n'est pas restée en marge de ce processus car la mairie s'est illustrée récemment dans des actes forts en faveur des femmes pour la filière cajou.
Il faut dire que c'est un honneur pour nous et une fierté de savoir que une dame de ma commune, à la personne de Madame Ata Kakayachi Sada, a été élue. C'est en même temps un défi pour nous.
Avec ce coup d'éclat, Madame Atta, présidente de la FENAPAB, élue pour 3 ans depuis le 23 septembre 2019, expose ici succinctement un plan de sa vision pour la filière cajou qui ne peut évidemment pas se réaliser sans le précieux concours des autorités en charge de l'agriculture au Bénin.
Actuellement, nous sommes à 130 000 tonnes. Mon souhait est qu'on fasse le double, sinon même pourquoi pas le triple du tonnage antérieur. Et ensuite, qu'on puisse transformer plus de la moitié de ces produits au niveau local, chez nous, pour le plein essor de cette filière. Les activités à mener, c'est de continuer le plaidoyer envers le public, les privés, dans le renforcement des capacités.
Cashew is an increasingly important crop for the countries in West Africa. For Benin, it's their second most valuable export. And we saw this big potential to grow and increase more.
Le cajou arrive en seconde place après le coton. À 110 000, 120 000 tonnes, en 2 ans, nous sommes passés à 120, 130, 140 000 tonnes. L'objectif du gouvernement, c'est d'aller à 300 000 tonnes à la fin du quinquennat.
Cashew me permet de vivre. Au moment où je n'avais pas suivi avec Cashew Bénin, les 2 hectares font 5 sacs. Et maintenant, avec Cashew Bénin, je vends 15 sacs cette année. Le projet nous a appris beaucoup de choses.
Il a formé 10 personnes, dont 9 femmes et 1 homme.
Après mon élection à la FENAPAB, les impressions sont bonnes. Surtout être à la tête d'une fédération nationale des producteurs d'anacarde du Bénin. Les points clés de mes actions sont relatifs à la recherche des partenaires pour améliorer la qualité de nos activités, développer le plaidoyer à l'endroit de l'État pour qu'il nous accompagne.
Benin Cashew is an innovative program aimed at strengthening and growing the Beninese cashew sector. Its goal is to create a more productive, competitive, sustainable, and inclusive economic growth engine for the people of Benin. It's being funded by the USDA and is being implemented by TechnoServe and our partners at CRS. Over 8 years, Benin Cashew will increase the yields and incomes of more than 49,000 smallholder farmers, triple Benin's domestic processing capacity, create more than 3,400 jobs, most of which will be held by women, and will position the entire sector for continued growth long after the project ends.
Technoserve travaille avec des hommes et des femmes pour bâtir des fermes et des entreprises compétitives qui contribuent à la réduction de la pauvreté, à l'augmentation de la résilience des bénéficiaires et de leur communauté. Nous restons convaincus que la participation pleine et entière des femmes et des filles permet de maximiser la croissance économique inclusive pour un développement généralisé. Au sein de la production agricole et notamment dans la filière cajou, bien que présentes, les femmes sont confrontées à des difficultés en ce qui concerne l'accès aux facteurs de production, notamment la terre, les ressources financières, la technologie et les formations. Au début du projet Benin Cashew, la participation des femmes était d'environ 20,57%. À fin décembre 2020, ce taux est passé à 34,67% au sein de la production et à 39% au sein du projet. L'objectif étant d'atteindre au moins 40% de participation des femmes. Pour atteindre ce résultat, nous avons mis en place un dispositif institutionnel avec tous les partenaires du projet pour intégrer le genre au sein de toutes les activités de ce projet. Nous avons un dispositif basé sur des points focaux genre qui ont reçu des formations sur différentes techniques, différentes thématiques. Nous avons mené aussi un plaidoyer pour la modification des tests statutaires des fêtières des producteurs de cajou afin d'alléger les conditions d'accès des femmes aux coopératives. Et nous avons pu avoir une femme présidente du conseil d'administration de la fêtière des producteurs d'anacarde et une femme présidente du conseil de surveillance de cette même organisation, ce qui est une première au Bénin au sein de la filière anacarde.
Après mon élection à la FENAPAB, les impressions sont bonnes. Surtout être à la tête d'une fédération nationale des producteurs d'anacarde du Bénin. Les points clés de mes actions sont relatifs à la recherche des partenaires pour améliorer la qualité de nos activités, développer le plaidoyer à l'endroit de l'État pour qu'il nous accompagne.
J'ai constaté qu'avec cette formation, la femme a un grand rôle à jouer pour l'émancipation et la prospérité, bien partagée qu'à l'intérieur, qu'à l'extérieur, au sein du foyer. Grâce à cette même formation, la population, mais la communauté a un regard craintif en nous. Ils nous copient, ils voient la manière dont nous vivons avec mon épouse. Grâce à cette formation, nous avons pu réaliser beaucoup de choses.
Cette formation que nous avons eue sur le champ nous a réveillés par rapport à la femme, parce que dans le maillon production, on a constaté que les femmes n'ont pas assez à la tête, donc du coup, elles sont marginalisées. Donc sur le terrain, nous voyons ce que les femmes sont prises en compte. Et comme le projet le recommande 40% des femmes, il faut dire que ce n'est pas facile. 40% des femmes dans tout ce que nous faisons, on doit pouvoir toucher au moins 40% des femmes.
Africa. A continent thriving with opportunities. 70% of the world's cocoa, 53% of the world's cashew. The resource-rich continent is at a turning point. By 2030, Africa will be home to 20% of the world's population. and 75% of people aged under 35. Yet, across the continent, some dynamics persist. The continent continues to export raw natural resources at low cost. Meanwhile, the resilience of its economies is tested by unemployment, poverty, and a global pandemic. Despite the challenges, together we can unlock this potential. At Arise IIP, our vision is to build an African industry. Our ambition is to shift Africa from a global commodity supplier to a global manufacturing powerhouse. We do this by identifying industrial gaps in African countries. We then design tailor-made infrastructure and solutions to enable the sustainable and local transformation of raw materials. In Gabon, where 85% of the land is covered by dense and pristine rainforest, we created from scratch a vibrant local timber industry. It did not happen overnight. We brought together local timber industry players and attracted foreign investors to create a competitive timber processing ecosystem. For this ecosystem to flourish, we attracted foreign investors, establishing linkages across the whole value chain, organizing trade shows for hosted companies to showcase and market their timber products, and boosting exports. GSE's Wood Cluster is now composed of 90 companies operating from the first to the third transformation of timber. All of them transforming ethically and sustainably sourced Gabonese wood. In less than 10 years, Gabon shifted from a net log exporter to the first exporter of veneer in Africa and second in the world. In fact, the real impact was much wider and more meaningful. With GSES, Arise IIP has created 16,000 jobs, attracted 120 investors coming from 18 different countries, operating in 19 industry sectors. In Togo, Benin, and Côte d'Ivoire, our work is underway, following the same approach. Cotton, cashew, soya, cocoa. We enable the transformation of local agricultural products with modern infrastructures and integrated logistics services. By investing in local manufacturing, we ultimately seek to replace foreign imports with domestic production. In all our endeavors, we are driven by the pursuit of green, sustainable growth, one that can last for generations to come. We are the pioneer of a green, responsible industrialization, one that ensures gender diversity, sustainability, traceability, and a zero-waste policy. This is why we create innovative solutions that support a climate-conscious economic development in Africa. This starts with neutralizing carbon emissions and creating a positive environmental legacy. By 2022, all of Arise IIP's industrial zones will be carbon neutral, powered fully by solar technology. This is all made possible by the dedication and commitment of the women and men who work at Arise. Together, we are on a journey to build an African industry, a journey to create a better, more resilient, sustainable, and inclusive future for everyone. Arise IIP, committed to making Africa thrive.
Je m'appelle Sinagero Kalilaki. J'ai 28 ans. Je suis née à Ina, dans la commune de Bembereke. Je suis mariée et nous avons 2 enfants. Quand je me réveille, je fais d'abord mes travaux domestiques. Je balaie la cour, la chambre, je lave mes bols. Je prépare le petit déjeuner pour la famille et je viens travailler en pépinière. C'est en 2019 que j'ai commencé à collaborer avec le projet Benekadjo. Quand j'ai connu le projet Benekadjo, on est rentré dans le système de professionnalisation. Et dans ce système, à cette date, nous avons déjà reçu 5 modules de formation. En plus de la pépinière d'anacardier, nous faisons la pépinière des manguis et des autres essences forestières. Après ça, nous faisons les cultures vivrières telles que le soja, l'arachide, le niébé. En dehors de ça, nous faisons le levage. On fait le levage des porcs et le levage des volailles. Pendant la pandémie du Covid-19, nous n'avons pas connu de difficultés par rapport à la main-d'œuvre. La main-d'œuvre était toujours disponible. La pandémie du Covid-19 a engendré des impacts dans notre entreprise parce qu'il y a eu la baisse du prix d'achat des produits. Benin Kaliou nous a aidés parce qu'on continuait par suivre les formations sur la professionnalisation et à chaque formation, on recevait la réponse sur le Covid-19. Après ce programme de professionnalisation qui est toujours en cours, on a appris à faire le bokashi. Le bokashi nous permet d'augmenter la production. Nous avons effectué un voyage en Tanzanie où on a appris beaucoup de choses sur l'agronomie de l'anacardier. Mes ambitions, c'est d'abord être compté parmi les plus grands pépiniéristes du Bénin. Aller à une production de 50 000 plants. Je veux avoir également un site moderne. Nous souhaitons que Benin Kaliou continue par nous appuyer surtout sur les aspects techniques de la
Recording in progress.
nous a apporté beaucoup de choses, beaucoup de connaissances. Je remercie sincèrement le projet Benin Kaliou pour ses efforts.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to another session of the ACA Global Market Encounter with Jim Fitzpatrick, which happens to be the 50th edition since we started. On behalf of the African Cashew Alliance, ACA, I thank every partner, sponsor, participant, intervener, guest, and those behind the scene who have made it possible, and of course to Jim Fitzpatrick. Before we begin, please note that the session will be held in English with a simultaneous French interpretation. To access this service, locate the globe icon on your screen. Select, select a preferred language and mute the original sound. For all questions and need for clarification as the presentation is ongoing, kindly use the Q&A feature and we will address them all after the presentation. Moving on to the agenda for today, I would like to hand over to Jim. Jim, good morning.
Good morning, Blessing. How are you doing?
I'm doing very well, Jim. How about you?
Yeah, not bad at all. Good morning, everyone. How are you all? Thank you for joining us again. Today, we're going to talk about, obviously, the market, as always. And then toward the end, we'll talk a little bit about selling premium quality cashew kernels and the certification issues related to that. This, of course, is aimed at African cashew processors. So, as usual, we'll start with the market, then we'll talk about selling quality cashew kernels. This is basically a marketing subject for cashew processors. And as Blessing mentioned, we'll talk about whatever questions, comments, and anything else that you'd like to talk about after that. So let's start with the market and a quick update on the activity and the issues that we've seen in the market over the past couple of weeks. Well, when we look at it, we're seeing a relatively quiet market. Kernels prices have remained quite steady. They're not taking off. Certainly not taking off. They're stuck down around the lower end of the range. Buyers are cautious. They're, I think, probably influenced by uncertain economic news, major holidays in Western countries over the past week, interest rates, and so many other issues at this time of year, which lend people toward a much quieter view of the market than they might have later on. The inventories are definitely tightening at destination, and that probably goes for all destinations. And we have seen some demand for prompt shipment and nearby shipment over the last 10 days or so, just particularly from Europe leading up to the Easter holidays. We saw quite a bit of buying of prompt nearby shipment. Now, that can be interpreted in many different ways. It probably indicates low levels of forward cover. In other words, that people have left their buying a little bit later in expectation of lower prices, but also in the uncertainty that the current economic conditions have added to the market and indeed to all markets. But it may also be a signal of improving demand. Let's hope so. Europe wasn't particularly badly affected in terms of its import volumes last year. So it's not surprising that we see that there's a relatively sluggish start to this year. So I think buyers are still looking to pick off some of the lower end prices. And they're looking really for the bottom of the market. I feel the bottom of the market has already passed. It'll be interesting to see how they react to that as the week goes on. Some of the importers will have low-priced forward sales. Some of those sales date back months, maybe as long as 6 months ago, some of them. And they will be anxious to cover those. They too will be looking for the bottom of the market. But there is probably something of a short position amongst importers, though perhaps not as great as it might be in a typical year. And interestingly, at least I find it interesting, quality is becoming an issue. And I say quality is becoming an issue at last because we have been on something of a downward spiral in the quality of cashew kernels for many years, probably 15 years. And it's pretty clear that the quality of cashews that you will find on the shelves of a supermarket in Europe or the United States, perhaps in Japan, perhaps in China, are a shadow of the quality of the kernels that you might have found 15, 20 years ago. Let's have a look at some of the origin impacts of this situation, particularly focused on the farm gate. So we are seeing lower prices at the farm gate, not only in West Africa, but also in Vietnam and in Cambodia. We've seen the raw cashew nut trade continue relatively slow. And prices are stabilizing, but they're stabilizing towards the lower levels. And the minimum farm gate prices in West African countries are now under pressure. And I'll come back to that a little bit later. I was interested to see some brokers and processors in Vietnam now starting to quote something that they're calling AFI quality. AFI is actually the basic standard for the sale of cashew kernels. Many buyers have their own additional or slightly different standards, but the AFI specification is the basic international specification for cashew kernels. And it is the spec that we are supposed to have been trading in for many years, but now we see that people are essentially talking about this as something different, something special, something premium. So we might conclude, as I was saying, that perhaps the race to the bottom on quality is over. In order to get prices lower and lower, in order to be more and more competitive, we have seen a watering down of specifications and quality, particularly in Vietnam, but not only in Vietnam. And this has caused almost two markets to arise. So part of the reason, for example, that Vietnamese cashew kernels have been so low in price is simply because they, in many cases, not all, but in many cases, they are an inferior specification to other origins. And we see that coming through in conversations in Vietnam, both internal and international conversations. We're also seeing in Vietnam, interestingly, in the last 2 weeks calls again, because these calls were heard before, for government intervention, some form of control on the import of what we call Burma kernels, that is unpeeled cashew kernels, part processed imports. And I think that the processors, or at least some of them, are rightly pointing out that this is perhaps a short-term benefit, but a long-term detriment to the cashew sector in Vietnam. Personally, I feel it's also been detrimental to the cashew sector in West Africa. So these are some of the origin impacts that we've seen of this quiet, relatively low-priced market, which is still, to a certain extent, looking for direction. Let's have a look at production. Obviously, at this time of year, production is the big issue. We'll have a look at production and we'll discuss some of the origins. So I'm hearing from Vietnam that the crop estimate, which was already a relatively poor crop, that people are talking that may be even lower again. And this is essentially down to poor weather, where in Binh Vuoc, where about 50% of the cashew acreage in Vietnam is, farm gate prices are down surprisingly low levels for Vietnam, partly to do with quality, I guess, but also partly to do with the market conditions and the huge imports, as usual, from Cambodia. But we're also seeing elsewhere, in Dong Nai, for example, we're seeing that the number of trees has been reduced, not dramatically, but it has been reduced. I think the report was at 1,100 hectares lower. So the target production in Vietnam for 2030, the official target to have 400,000 hectares planted, up from an estimated 305,000 at the moment, an improved yield to 2.2 tons per hectare, really doesn't look likely to be achieved on what we're seeing this year and what we've seen in the last 2 years. So Vietnam's dependence on imports is unlikely to change in the coming years. Looking at Cambodia, now become a major producer, we are seeing some concerns, and we're seeing a wide range of estimates. So we're seeing estimates of the crop now anywhere from 500,000 tons to 800,000 tons. Usually when you find a wide range of estimates, it probably indicates that something is changing and that some people are, let's say, more pessimistic than others. But from what I understand, it seems unlikely now that the crop will exceed last year's level, which was a good crop, in the region of 720,000 tons by my calculations. And the export would seem to confirm that, although exports started a little earlier this year. But Cambodia, according to the Vietnamese customs, has sent 317,000 tons to Vietnam in the first 3 months of the year. That's about 4% down on last year's figure. Still a pretty healthy figure, but possibly, given the early start of the crop, indicating that the estimates of the crop in the 800,000 ton range are probably overstated for this year. Nonetheless, Cambodia will be the largest supplier of raw cashew nuts to Vietnam again in 2023. In India, not much change, still quite a good crop forecast. People are mentioning 750,000 tons, which would be the highest crop of recent years. Farm gate prices have started a little bit lower, and maybe that's just a temporary factor, but I do, looking around the reports, I do see farm gate prices or reported market prices in local markets a little bit lower in India this year than in previous years. And we also, if you read the Indian press, you'll also see farmers talking about this in certain areas and talking about lower prices and the impact on them. And there are a couple of interesting stories if you want to have a look at them in the major Indian media outlets. Ivory Coast, well, we talked the last time about a poor first flush, a poor first crop due to the weather conditions. The official forecast still remains optimistic, which would make Côte d'Ivoire the largest producer in the world again in 2023. But farm gate prices have been slipping, and they're now, having had a little bit of a spike early in the season, they're now below the minimum level in many cases. And I'm going to come back to that a little bit later on. Guinea-Bissau, good crop forecast. The news is of a minimum price of 375 CFA. The market is below the minimum price. There are some old crop stocks around. It's difficult for me to see how that minimum price can be maintained in the present market conditions, but the crop forecast remains relatively optimistic. Looking back, Benin, Ghana, Nigeria, I've put them together as one simply because there's not much change. The crop forecast remains good. Farm gate prices in all three countries are lower, and they are below the minimum pricing in Ghana and Benin. And Nigeria doesn't have a minimum pricing range. It has a very light touch cashew policy, generally speaking. So if we look generally in the market, we're seeing a situation where you have a certain amount of old crop in Côte d'Ivoire, more old crop in Guinea-Bissau. The old crop in Côte d'Ivoire doesn't appear to be weighing heavily on the market, but in Guinea-Bissau there is a problem to be solved. So the falling farm gate prices encourages buyers to wait, and the longer they wait, the more the price falls. The longer they wait, the less cash is in the system to buy at the farm gate. We're seeing the impact of that with lower prices. Burkina Faso, I don't have a box there for Burkina Faso or for Guinea, but my understanding is the crop is coming in quite well, mixed results in Guinea, again, prices under pressure. And in Senegal, we're probably looking at a crop in 2 to 3 weeks from now. The next time we talk, if we talk, we will have some information on the Senegal crop. So let's look at the overall impact of that on the production. So I have reduced my estimates of the 2023 crop slightly. If you've joined us before, you'll be familiar with the way I do it. I have a low estimate and a high estimate. And by judging the distance between the two, which as you can see is quite broad, that is a measure of the degree of uncertainty as to the final outturn. So the volatility in this at the moment would be in the size of the Cambodian crop. There's a question mark over that. And the impact in Côte d'Ivoire, the largest producer of that poor first crop, will that follow through into the second crop? And I'm getting mixed reports. Some people are telling me that they're seeing plenty of raw material, but that it's lower quality. Others are telling me that they're just staying out of the market because the prices are falling. So all of these factors are bringing the minimum pricing regimes into question. And there are really some difficult calls for African regulators in the current market. So I did a quick analysis and I looked at Côte d'Ivoire farm gate. So the red line is the minimum price set down by the CCA, the regulatory body. And the blue bars above the line is the high, which is very close to the minimum, as you can see, and more likely than the low reported price. So always there's a range of prices reported: quality, location, the relative strength of buyer and seller, the availability of finance, all influence these things. But what we are seeing clearly is that the prices are headed below the minimum. Processors are faced then with a difficult question. Most of them being based in the country, being the beneficiaries of government subsidies, would be reluctant to break the minimum price regime. Most of them, I think, try to stick to it, though not all. But what it does is it brings trade to a halt. And bring trade to a halt makes the problem worse. Similarly, if we look at Benin, same situation, probably a little bit worse right now. And similarly in Ghana, again, high price set. So the case of Ghana is interesting. The original logic for the minimum price around 850 cedis was quite logical. It fit very well with the international raw cashew nut price. It made good reading to read the statement back in December, I think it was December 15th, when the TCDA talked about the reasons they picked this price. But what we have seen is we've seen a lower raw cashew nut market. We've seen a flow of raw material into Ghana, as always, from surrounding countries, and a relatively quiet market. So following initial spike in prices, farm gate prices have drifted back again. And I think in so much as that the minimum does in any case impact trade in Ghana, it may need to be revised. So it's much more likely to impact trade in Benin and Cote d'Ivoire than in Ghana because of the nature of the legislation. But it may need to be changed in Ghana as a signal to farmers and to buyers. If we look at Benin, we see a lot of stakeholders quite frustrated. I was in Benin a few weeks back and had a very good trip and a lot of very enthusiastic developments and a lot of enthusiastic stakeholders and some interesting changes in policy in Benin. The CFA price, 350, the minimum price, is workable versus raw cashew nut export right now, in theory, but of course, export is banned until May. So this is part of the transitionary arrangements toward the export ban, which is planned for April of next year. So without the financing, the cash generated, and with limited number of buyers, the price at the farm gate has been lower, or at least the offered price has been lower. There has been buying by exporters to bring the product to the port for later export, which is quite legitimate. But processors do struggle with this price of 350. And that's due to as we've talked now 3 or 4 times this year, this mismatch between the raw cashew nut price and cashew kernels. And as we know, Benin raw cashew is very popular in India, tends to command a high price, and that's creating this tension. So it needs very careful management to make sure that stakeholders are looked after, that farmers are not left with unsold stock, and particularly that a cross-border informal or illegal trade is not created. So difficult times for regulators managing the current prices. And it's interesting that they would find that difficulty in so much as that the market has not been that volatile. So it hasn't been a case that volatility in the market has caused this situation. This situation has been relatively clear for 3 months now. So moving on to Vietnam and moving on to have a look at Vietnamese imports of raw cashews, we see a little bit of a slowdown in the second half of March, but still a very strong import performance in terms of volume in 2023 so far. We see 21% up on last year. And if you look at the chart, I've mapped 4 years. I've left out 2021 simply because 2021 figures were highly distorted and they haven't as yet been corrected by Vietnam Customs. And probably the estimates in 2021 were possibly as much as 300,000 tons overstated. So I've left out 2021 to get a valid comparison. So what you see is monthly imports, January, February, March, cumulative, and then the cumulative for the first quarter. So you can see that 2023, January to March, is well ahead of last year and miles ahead of 2020, which was a COVID disrupted year, and 2019. And when we look at it, it's quite interesting to notice that it's not just the Cambodian imports that are affecting this. There are much higher imports from Tanzania. Tanzanian imports in the first quarter are up 58% on last year. Cote d'Ivoire is slightly down, but generally the West African origins, it doesn't mean an awful lot. I think Nigeria is well up, it's more than double, but Nigerian imports in the first quarter into Vietnam are relatively small anyway. I think the figure now is around about 12,000 tons. And similarly with Ghana, much more than last year, but again, we're still looking at relatively low numbers compared to Tanzania, which I think is 95,000 tons in the first quarter, and Cambodia, which is 317,000 tons in the first quarter. I noticed a typo there. Cambodia is minus 4.2%, not plus 4.2%. So if we look at this, we're seeing higher imports, probably in anticipation of a poor national crop, certainly a lower carry-in, and we're now seeing the early Cambodian crop, the imports slowing down slightly, but still good figures. And I suppose they're might be amongst Vietnamese buyers of raw cashew nuts and traders an expectation of high competition from India, given India's massive increase in raw cashew nut imports last year. So that's imports to Vietnam. Looks quite healthy so far. And let's see how that actually impacts on the balance sheet in Vietnam. So I'm calculating the various estimates of different factors, and I'm trying to get to a carry-out so that we can compare with last year. So if we look at imports, total imports well ahead of last year. Imports from Cambodia down slightly, down that 4%. Crop estimate, in my opinion, probably down slightly. It's on the reports I'm hearing, but the Vietnamese crop is not a major factor anymore. Compared to India, Cambodia, Cote d'Ivoire, Vietnamese domestic production is not a major factor. Exports of cashew kernels are up. We'll have a look at those in a moment. Domestic consumption, I think the import of unpeeled Burma kernels is probably down on what I can gather. I don't have the actual statistics on this, but I think it is down, which obviously impacts the supply. So if we look at the carry-in, higher carry-in this year, excluding the transit stocks, and this leads us to a calculation of the inventory. So when we look at it, what we're seeing is perhaps slightly lower carry out from the first quarter into the rest of the year than last year, but nothing to make really any major difference. What is interesting is if we look at the import values during January, March. Now, bear in mind, we're comparing here customs values from one year to another. So these are not trade values or contract values. These are the declared customs and excise import values. The unit price is down by about $200 a ton. And that is in line with the decline in kernels, but probably not enough in line with the decline in kernels prices. So that halfway through the major import season, the Cambodian import season in the first quarter, halfway through the Cambodian crop, we're looking at much lower values, bearing in mind that Cambodian cashews trade at higher prices than African cashews. And we're also seeing the value average down despite more imports from Tanzania. And Tanzania would be, again, a high quality, generally premium price origin. So the overall situation is similar to last year, about 4 months processing stock, if these figures add up correctly. 4 months processing stock, given that we're getting towards the end of the Cambodian season, given that it's maybe 3 months from putting the deal together to getting the West African raw nuts into the factory, this is normal, relatively modest stock. There's no overstocking, in my opinion. It's been lower, it's been higher, but there's no particular alarm bells one way or the other. Let's have a look at exports. And again, looking at 5-year comparison of Vietnam's monthly cumulative kernels of export last year, just slightly down on 2021. So we're still looking at exports in or around record levels. Let's have a look at some of the destinations. So if we look, I picked out a few destinations to make this a little bit more manageable for us. So if we look at the US, so we see the cumulative figure at the end of February in orange, and the same figure cumulative at the end of March. So for the United States, at the end of February, exports from Vietnam were down 28%. But by the end of March, that figure was reduced to down by 17%. So that's quite a significant improvement. Looking at Europe, and I took the Netherlands and Germany as the two major import destinations. Again, we see an improvement. It was down 26%. It's now down 18%. Very similar figures. The two star performers over the first part of the year were the UAE and China. Now, obviously, both of these markets are much smaller than either the North American market or the European market, But China is important in the first quarter. It removes product, it brings cash, some of its high-value product, some of its low-quality products, so it gets a nice mix of product moving in Vietnam. And we see a pretty strong performance. Imports by China from Vietnam are strong in the first quarter. They much better than last year, 123% up. Don't forget, early last year, China was still heavily disrupted by COVID. They are a little bit lower than the record year, which would have been the year before, but still pretty strong. UAE, relatively small market. Remember, this is a market in the Middle East. Generally, we're looking at a market of about 60,000 tons compared to the US market in a good year around about 180,000 tons, just to put that in perspective. But again, we've seen strong January, February shipments, and that's easing back a little bit during March. But those markets pretty strong in the first quarter. So that's quite good. We've seen just about all destinations improved during March versus last year. Shipments to the US, 13,800 tons approximately, were very strong in March. Now that may or may not be indicative of a change in demand pattern in the US, we will see, but it's certainly quite positive. But shipments to the major European countries, relatively sluggish during the first quarter. March didn't show the kind of improvement except to the Netherlands, as the United States did. So overall, looking at our market picture, looking at the outlook, we're seeing good crops, generally speaking, already factored into the pricing. So I don't think any buyer looking at this market early April will be saying that there's any good news on crops to come that might impact the price of kernels. In terms of raw cashew nuts, we're certainly seeing the tension mounting between the minimum pricing and the market pricing, and that's clear in countries with strong regulatory regimes, Benin, Cote d'Ivoire, for example, possibly to come in Guinea-Bissau, and these tensions probably need some action from the regulatory bodies because I don't think the market's going to sort this out, at least in the short term. Processors, well, that gap that we've spoken about is closing, that gap between the raw cashew nut price and the kernels price, but it's closing at the expense of farmers. And we're seeing lower farm gate prices right across the world. And that's essentially due to pressure or lack of movement on cashew kernels prices. Demand, looking in the West, looking to the US and Europe, definitely forward cover is light, forward cover is needed. Inventories are certainly reduced, particularly in Europe, but it may take another few weeks before we see people come to the market. It won't be this week for certain, I reckon, but it could be starting in the early days of May. We might start to see a little bit more activity. And it'll be interesting to see how Vietnamese processors, under such pressure for profit margins, how they will react to that, whether they will drop their prices and panic as they have done in previous years, or whether they might act a little bit more strongly this year. Key factor, of course, in demand is the demand in India, the world's largest consumer. Looks to me as if demand in India is relatively quiet. Perhaps it's paused financial year end in India, just past. The rupee has been a little bit weaker, which may have surprised some people. It may strengthen. People may be waiting for it to strengthen. But with interest rate movements, dollar interest rate movements, and the lack of rupee interest rate movements, the currency weakened over the past week. And India is a net importer of cashews, 1.3 million tons of RCN imported last year. So the rate of the Indian rupee to the US dollar is really significant in the calculation for processors and for the market. Costs, I was having a look at freight costs over the past week or so, and most places seem to be back to what we might call as their pre-pandemic levels. And this is not particularly good news for African processors because it has undermined part of the cost advantage, the lower freight costs particularly from West Africa, I was looking also at East Africa, where rates are much higher than West Africa. Now, we did see significant decline in the freight rates. From January to March, we have seen, with MSC, we've seen a 25% decline in the freight rate. So it is coming around, though in East Africa, rates still remain high. West Africa, much more competitive, but there are certain problematic areas. Cotonou, for example, still has some quite high rates. But unfortunately, it seems that lower freight rates mean that some of the competitive advantage for West African processors is undermined. And we'll have another look at that in a moment. So the outlook from my perspective is relatively quiet trading conditions for the rest of the week, probably into next week. Tension at the farm gate, I think that's a factor to be looked at. I don't think that it's likely to result in higher raw cashew nut prices, at least in the short term, but it could result in governments having another look at their regulation and the way they're managing the cashew sector in some of the countries. And some may need to do so, some may choose not to do so and just let the trade follow through. I suppose there's a couple of other factors that we should just consider without drawing too many conclusions, and that is the impact of informal cross-border trade between countries in West Africa and the impact of different quality ranges between countries and how that's impacting the relative strength of prices. I mean, particularly Ghana is the great example of that, where you see varying qualities exported as Ghanaian material. And it's not always up to the standard that we would expect from Ghana or CN. So this brings us to the second area of discussion this week. We're going to talk about selling premium quality kernels. And this is focused on African processors because whether they know it or not, most African processors are making a superior product to that which is available from Vietnam, for example. So I've put in a photograph there of some Benin cashew kernels. These are from an excellent processor there called Fludor. And they are making, and many processors in Benin are making some of the tastiest, brightest color cashew kernels that you're ever likely to see. And it reminded me again when I was in Benin that really freshness is important for cashew kernels. And the taste, again, in Benin, it's reminded me of the taste of the cashew kernels in southern India many years ago. And that, to a certain extent, has been lost. We have certainly seen much lower quality, certainly at retail level here in Europe. And that has an impact. And it's interesting just to think that many consumers of cashew kernels have never tasted a top quality cashew nut. They've never tasted a top quality fresh cashew nut. Most of the cashews we get, by the time they reach us, would be 9 months to a year old. So let's talk about selling premium quality kernels from the African perspective. And first of all, let's have a look at pricing. So does quality mean anything in terms of pricing? I had a processor say to me recently, we were chatting about marketing and we were chatting about quality marketing. And he said, Jim, it doesn't matter, whatever we do, if the price in Vietnam is low, we'll only get a low price. But it's not true. So we did, again, you may have seen this chart from me before, but what we have here is FOB prices for 320s, price comparisons. So as always, there's a range of prices. So we look at, in Vietnam, 4 different specs. For China, what I would call the lower end of the food safety quality management system certification. Quality cashews maybe with BRC certification, and then this new idea of actually quoting AFI specification with the BRC certificate. And you can see each one gets a higher price. Indian export prices, I was really surprised at the World Cashew Conference in Dubai to talk to importers and realize the prices they're prepared to pay for high quality cashew kernels. And you can see that's there. African cashew kernels, as we've spoken about many times over the 50 episodes of this event, that high quality African cashew kernels have been able to make premium prices compared to Vietnamese kernels, and so on. Brazil too, higher prices. And then we get into the more specialist areas, domestic price in India, organic cashews from Vietnam, and organic cashews from Africa. Average prices over the month of March. So if you are a producer of a high quality cashew kernel, this is your target range. You want to be locating yourself with Indian export prices, the higher quality of African BRC certified plants, and Brazilian. This is the target area. If you've picked the right customer and they're telling you that Vietnam is so much cheaper, it's probably because they're looking for a lower spec product. It's probably because price is so important to them that they're perhaps not really in a position to buy premium quality cashew kernels. And the reason for that is simply because many of the supermarkets, many of the retailers generally, and many consumers are just not aware of the differences in the quality of cashew kernels. But if you tasted those Benin cashew kernels that I tasted, and which I did a little sampling around with some friends and family, they couldn't believe the quality of those kernels. They couldn't believe the difference in the taste. So the question is really, how do we look at this in terms of marketing? And let's have a look at what's happened in recent years. Again, let's look at 320 prices. So we're plotting prices here, general market prices from Vietnam and reported prices. So I collect information from individual processors and I correlate that information to try and judge what are the prices. So here's the chart from January 19 until last March. In general market, which is Vietnam, of course, being the major supplier to the world, and then the general price across African processors. Now, what we are seeing is since the second half of last year that price premium has declined. It reached its peak during the pandemic, and it has since declined. We'll just put in those two markers. So that's our 5-year average and our 2-year average. Just keep an eye on them as markers, let's say. And then we'll just plot the freight correction. So if we take the African FOB price and then we correct it for the freight advantage that was there during that period, you can see one of the reasons that the price premium has closed in again is that the correction for freight has evaporated. So at one time, this was very wide. I think at one time it was 21 cents a pound in the difference, really significant. That's closed now. So you're getting a drop in this gap, this wide gap that persisted throughout the pandemic. But notably, there is still a premium. There is still a premium for African cashew kernels, and that is trading almost on a daily basis. Again, I suppose it's interesting also just to remind ourselves that generally prices, whether it's African, Vietnamese, or Indian, are well below the 2-year average price, the red dotted line, and miles below the 5-year average price. So looking at this chart, again, you would still expect that at some point in the future, perhaps during 2023, we'll see a correction in prices. And we may well see that after the main production season in the Northern Hemisphere has passed. So we've looked at price premiums and we've looked at the target area in terms of price. So let's talk about how we can access markets and how African processors can access those premium markets. Well, the first factor is quality management systems, or QMS. And I would say that a good quality management system that's certified is the entry ticket. It's not going to get you everything you need as a processor. It's not going to generate premium prices, but it is going to allow you to start to have that conversation. Basic level, a HACCP system that can be enhanced by an ISO or an FSSC certification, But in reality, to access markets, particularly in Europe and the United States, where these products may be valued, and often high-quality kernels are used without roasting, which generates a premium because color and taste is obviously really important. We really need to be thinking about higher levels of food safety certification or quality management systems. BRC, GFSI, IFS, ABI, all important. Not easy, but possible. And we've seen plenty of examples of that. And I'm happy to say that in those companies that I know that have achieved these kind of levels of certification, where that has been combined with good sales and marketing, they have managed to make these premium prices, and they've managed the two key things. A is to be able to sell your product when you want to sell your product, and B is to make a price and terms that allow you to make a profit. If we added to that, which is possible in many African countries, supply chain certification. So if a good quality management system gets you into the game, supply chain certification gets you front row seats, if I can use that analogy. So traceability certification, SMETA, possibly organic or fair trade, but really these kinds of certification, traceability to meet legal requirements in some countries, and also as a risk management strategy, and SMETA to certify good practice in the supply chain. These are becoming key. If you can access those, it helps. If you want to go down the road of being organic, and that's difficult and it's expensive, or if you want to go down the road of fair trade, which is complex and quite limited, it can enhance your ability to reach these markets. But it's becoming clearer and clearer that these kind of certifications, supply chain certification of practice, ethical trade, traceability, is becoming more and more important in accessing these high quality markets. So what can make African cashew kernels a premium product? And we're going to go back to some basics of marketing. And we're going to talk about the 5 Ps: product, place, people, promotion, and in the case of cashews, planet. There are 7, but I use 5 and I put planet in there in the case of cashews. So if we talk about product, what can make African cashew kernels more attractive? Well, as we've seen with the Benin product, but not just Benin, with Ghanaian, Ivorian, color, taste, size, freshness, packing, all of these factors are difficult to match in chains that rely on imported raw cashew nuts. Place. Which market do you choose? And if we look at West African cashew processors, we look at proximity to markets in Europe and the United States. But also in terms of place is the channel. Are you going to use a broker? Are you going to go directly to a manufacturer? If you go direct, it's easier to develop a relationship. There's more chance of developing a premium. That's simply a fact. People, and this is an area, unfortunately, where many processors have failed in terms of the service they offer, the communications, the building of relationships, and the reliability within contracts and within those relationships. This is an area where a lot of factories have failed, and we've talked about that before on African Cashew Alliance events. We talked about not investing in sales staff, not investing in marketing. We've talked about management styles, where a proprietor or chief executive keeps the marketing to themselves. It's seen as a high status activity, but in actual fact, they're not very good at it. Promotion. Do we promote cashew kernels? No. Resounding no. Customers are not aware of the difference between African kernels and Vietnamese kernels. They're not aware of the difference of quality, the difference in terms of sustainability. Do we have good market information systems? Absolutely not. We do not inform people. How do we promote? Mostly, we don't. There are some trade shows, some very old-fashioned events, some very old-fashioned approaches. But generally speaking, promotion is neglected. Promotion is essential to turn this product into a premium product. And finally, planet. And this is something that cannot be matched except by origin processed kernels. So if you import 60% of the kernels that you process, for that 60%, you cannot match the origin in terms of sustainability, responsibility, social impact. And I add a fourth because it's somewhat neglected in West Africa with some notable exceptions, and that is the use of the byproducts. This is more and more important. It's actually important not only from a planet and a sustainability point of view, but it's also important for the economics. We saw recently the reaction in Vietnam to lower prices for shell and cashew nut shell liquid and the impact that had on processors. So when we look at the overall picture in terms of marketing and we ask ourselves, how well do we do this? We're not coming out top of the class. The product is definitely there. But in terms of marketing and processors marketing, it's not been done well. And that is the key to making African cashew kernels a premium product in destination markets. So how can that be achieved? I think I can answer this question simply because I have experience of doing this with a number of processors who have done so successfully. And we put a few basic factors. Number one, know your strengths. Know your strengths and improve your weaknesses. And this is a basic business practice, which is somewhat neglected in the struggle to survive. Secondly, customer selection. Select customers that value your product advantages. So if you produce a light color, fresh, tasty, food-safe cashew kernel, your customer might ideally be a packer who doesn't roast, who packs plain cashews where the cashew is visible in the pack and who aims at premium markets. It's unlikely to be a discounter who's simply focused on price. Build relationships, but build them patiently. So we talk about relationships. Don't wait till the warehouse is full to start selling. Build relationships, build them patiently. But it's also necessary, particularly for a new processor, to have a short-term problem-solving strategy. So while you're building the relationship, where are you selling the product? The nature of relationships and buyers who value relationships is that they will take a little bit longer to do business with you. It will take a little bit of time to get everything in place to start business. What do you do in the meantime? What's your problem-solving strategy to stop your warehouse filling up with cashew kernels? Fourth factor, invest in marketing staff and invest in promotion. For owners and proprietors, do not be afraid to hand marketing off to staff so long as you've got qualified staff. And I think it's about time we realized, as you can see in many, many businesses, particularly in Western style businesses, that sales is the most important function. It's also the one which is least in our control in a volatile market, which only underlines just how important it is, and that sales is linked to good market information and understanding. Offer physical evidence. So by physical evidence, and that can be also one of the 5 Ps, it can be the 6th or the 7th, offer certifications, audits, invite buyers to visit, offer samples, keep records of your performance, particularly in relation to quality and food safety. Offer specifications. Make it clear that this is the product you're offering. And there are opportunities now to offer bespoke specifications. In other words, individual buyers, individual specifications that might particularly suit them in terms of reaching a quality or in terms of balancing quality and price points. So they may not want to hit the highest price or the lowest price in their case, but they may be happy to work around that in terms of the overall quality. And finally, don't rely on governments, projects, NGOs for marketing. Almost without exception, they know less about sales and marketing than you do. This is something that you need to develop yourselves. Trade associations may have a role to play, but it is not, nor has it ever been, the role of NGOs, projects, and governments to develop sales within individual companies. Where it does work is with export promotion bodies. So organizations like the GEPA in Ghana has a role to play, but they're promoting a sector. But for your own individual business, you need to develop your own sales and marketing skills. So, tying back to our subject last time round, there is an African processing revolution happening. Processors have a choice to be part of it, or, as we said the last time, they have a choice to wait and hope and see if a customer comes along. But if processors want to access markets that are suitable for their products, premium markets, then we need to develop marketing strategies, marketing skills that will allow them to do so. So thanks very much. That's it from me. Let me hand you back to Blessing and see if there are any questions. Blessing.
Thank you very much, Jim, for the presentation. Yes, we do have some questions that have been dropped in the Q&A feature, which I would read out to you. So the first question says, do you think the export ban is a good initiative, or would you consider it a limitation?
I think an export ban is a very difficult policy to implement. I think that the key factor is the transition from free export to banned export, and that probably means various steps along the way. I think everyone would like to see a situation that individual countries can process all of the cashews that they grow there. If that happens, it usually means farmers get higher prices, quality improves, export value and foreign exchange earnings increase. But it needs to be managed carefully because, as we've seen in Kenya in the past, we've seen in Benin now, there are many different aspects to this. So the difficult part is banning export as a statement of support for processing, but at the same time, balancing that against the potential negative impact on farmers' farm gate prices and the risk that the product may not move at all. So we see in Benin, for example, this year, measures to transition, but we see those themselves are not without tensions. So I can't say whether I think it's a bad idea or a good idea. I think it can be effective if it's managed properly. Blessing.
Thank you very much, Jim. The next question says, what do you think about minimums, considering the buyers determine the price? How effective are the regulatory bodies?
Well, let's think where minimum pricing regimes came from. And you got to go back in the history of it. If you go back in the history, you'll see that I'm going back to 2005, and the farm gate prices were around about $200 a ton. Sometimes they were as low as $150 a ton for cashew kernels, for raw cashew nuts at the farm gate in West Africa. When you look at that, you can quite understand why governments would want to introduce minimum prices. The key question is, how do you decide what the minimum price is? How do you manage that in a volatile market? What's your formula to develop a minimum price, number one? Secondly, is that minimum price flexible throughout the season? So if the market's volatile, do you lift or drop the minimum price accordingly? how do you communicate that? How do you, in a minimum price regime, how do you manage differences in quality? So if we think of how our price is made, the questioner says that buyers determine prices. Well, it's a lot more than just buyers. Supply and demand, location, quality, payment terms, the number of intermediaries, a whole range of factors determine prices. The effectiveness of the regulatory body depends on how well they manage, firstly, the determination of the price and managing expectations both from farmers and from buyers as well. And secondly, how they manage that price in the season. In a busy, volatile season, prices can move up and down. How does the regulatory body respond to that? And that's really important. Now, it's unpopular to drop farm gate prices, even if the market says you should. But it's also important to protect incomes. So if we were in a position of heavy surplus, or if we were in a position of high levels of exploitation at the farm gate, then you would say minimum prices are absolutely essential. But right now, we've seen minimum prices, our farm gate prices go up, and we've seen minimum prices respond to that. I think regulatory bodies have to be a bit more efficient in their management of farm gate prices, in how they calculate the initial farm gate prices. I think it should be less political. I think it has to be better explained. And I think if that's done, I think they're quite good ideas. Now, not all countries are suitable for minimum pricing. It has to work with a series of policy measures. If it does, it may be that minimum pricing as a regulatory legal factor works for some countries, but other countries might need something like guide pricing or reference pricing, which allows farmers to negotiate based on the advice of the government. But certainly if you set a price in February or December and expect that that price is your last word for the entire season, I think you're always going to end up in a situation where you create the kind of tensions that we're seeing right now. Blessing.
Thank you very much, Jim. And the next question says, how can Africa attract investors to set up processing units here?
Well, I think we have seen good developments in processing and in investment. I think that a number of things would help that. I think that building product awareness and better promotion of the product would enhance investors' confidence. I think better engagement of financial institutions would build investor confidence. I think that the more consistency in policy, more consistency in pricing, better explanation of pricing, as we've just been discussing, more transparency would all enhance the perspective on the sector from an investor's point of view. There is no doubt that there are many, many investors for many, many different reasons that are interested in the sector, ranging from pure profit motivation right down to social impact, environmental reasons. There are lots of reasons to invest. Sometimes we don't get the story out as well as we might. So I think the opportunities are there. They don't just have to be financial. We've seen very successfully in Côte d'Ivoire financial incentives, subsidies, tax breaks. They will work, but also all of those other factors, because not every country can offer subsidies. Blessing.
Thank you very much, Jim. And the next question says, well, thank you, AC and Jim, for 50 episodes of this wonderful session. Jim, will you say the entire cashew in and has returned to post-COVID levels?
No, I wouldn't say that it has recovered completely from the impact of COVID-19. I think that there are still a number of factors there. I think they have been compounded by economic conditions, the war in Ukraine, and other factors in the last year or so. I think that there is a prospect for a return to pre-COVID levels in terms of demand growth. And I think we're beginning to see the first green shoots, as they say, of that. So I think the prospect for a return to what we might see as the level of growth in demand that we saw prior to the pandemic from 2023 end and into 2024, but we're by no means fully recovered from that just yet. It's done a lot of damage. Back to you, Blessing.
So, thank you very much, Jim. And the next question is, a contribution. The marketing of kernel, why don't you encourage it within the continent, the African continent, as there is no more regulation needed compared to US and Europe? Lila from Tanzania. That's a contribution. Do you want to react or add something to that?
I think that it is realistic to encourage consumption in African countries, and I think that is done. But at the same time, the promise of future consumption is not going to generate investment. So if we look at where are the existing markets, investors need to look at, if I build now, where can I sell now or next year? Certainly the encouragement of domestic consumption, and indeed, bear in mind that cashews are a healthy food, so it has opportunities on multiple levels. But if I'm an investor, I'm looking for where can I sell now and where are the best returns on my investment likely to happen. And for that reason, the immediate solution is to look at markets that buy cashew kernels and then markets that are interested in the unique selling proposition that African cashew kernels offer. So yes, you're right. Domestic consumption in each country is important, but it will take time to develop that. Blessing.
Thank you very much, Jim. And the last question on my list here is, someone is asking that you expatiate P5, the one on Planet.
On Planet? Sure. Let's go back. Just put that slide on the screen. So when we talk about Planet, we're talking about how the African cashew sector differently impacts the environment than, say, the raw cashew nut trade. So if we look at simple things, the movement of cashew kernels, of raw cashew nuts by truck from the area that they're grown to the processing plant involves far more sustainable footprint, far less carbon than moving the product. And we have calculated this. So if you take a cashew grown in Côte d'Ivoire, consumed in the United States, say in the central United States, the journey of that cashew nut is calculated as 28,000 kilometers. You can halve that journey by processing locally. So that's one area of sustainability. You remove that major footprint of the raw cashew nut trade. Growing cashew kernels in Africa and processing them makes them much more sustainable. But also, processing locally tends to make the processor much more responsible in relationships with suppliers, with farmer groups, and other suppliers, including workers in the chain. Local businesses, and this is worldwide, local businesses tend to treat local people better than distant businesses. So the extraction of raw materials for processing abroad is less sustainable and tends to be less responsible. And it tends to sacrifice the opportunity for social impact. So processors who are doing well out of the local industry have the opportunity to make an impact in their communities. And that's been seen not only in African countries, but in Asian countries, in European countries, and right around the world. So that's what I mean on Planet. There's a lot you can read on that, and there's a lot you can read on the 5 Ps or the 7 Ps. And if you're interested, it's well worth having a look. Blessing.
Thank you very much, Jim. We have exhausted all the questions, but I have some questions, Jim. It's been 50 Wednesdays, 50 edition of the Global Market Encounter. What are the remarkable growth that you've noticed from the very first session to now in the cashew industry?
Wow. Well, I think what we've seen is that the industry has become more resilient. And when we started this, I thought it would be for 4 or 5 sessions during COVID. We started in 2020 during COVID, and then we would very quickly just go back to the more normal market information systems. What we have found is there's a huge interest in market information. There's a huge interest in understanding how the market works. And we're finding that, I suppose, good and bad. On one side, we're finding that the new processors are really interested in moving on, but we're also finding that they have a struggle in finding markets and developing their marketing. I think I've been really happy to see how so many factories all around the world in the cashew industry managed the pandemic and the huge challenges that it brought. And I think it's also been interesting to see that consumers have been consistently switching to cashews. If we talk about some of the shocks or challenges, I think that the demand performance in the United States in the second half of last year was a little bit shocking, how we saw imports decline so quickly. And I think we're probably at the moment in a period of transition where we're getting away from cheap food. We're getting away from the fact that the only thing that matters is price. And so long as you can get the price down, the quality doesn't count. I think we're moving away from that. We certainly have in other products, and I think it's happening in ours now. It has been a really challenging period. Cashews has never been an easy business. I've been in it a long time. This period has been one of the most difficult, but it's also shown a great deal of resilience. And we look at the growth in processing in West African countries and look at particularly thinking about 2022 and the increase in market share up to, was it 14.3%? We talked about market share for African processors in Europe last year. And that to me is a huge sign of a positive future ahead. And that fills me with enthusiasm and hope for the future. Blessing.
Thank you very much, Jim, for 50 editions of the ACO Global Markets Encounter. Before we come to an end, I would like to ask that you share with us what we should look out for from now to the next GME.
I think we need to keep a close eye on what's happening at the farm gate in West African countries. We need to keep a close eye on the regulators' reactions to those changes. I don't think we're going to see huge developments in kernels, but look out, because later in the year, I believe we will see a much more active cashew kernels market. I think we need to keep a close eye on the crop in Cambodia and how it develops and how it turns out. If there were to be a significantly smaller than expected crop in Cambodia, that would have an immediate impact on RCN trade in West Africa. I'm not saying there is a problem. In fact, I think there is still a good crop there, but I think it needs to be closely watched. I also think we need to keep an eye on the reaction of Indian buyers of raw cashew nuts and demand in India. Last year, Indian demand for raw cashew nuts was a big driver in the market, and that was matched by consumer demand in India. Will that continue in 2023? 6 weeks ago, had you asked me that question, I would have said almost certainly. Today, there's a little bit of a pause, and therefore we need to keep an eye on what's happening in India. I would also like to add my thanks to everyone who's participated in these events, given it's the 50th benchmark event, particularly to those contributors who have made presentations. And throughout the events, I've been really pleased to find contributors and presenters who believed in what they were doing and presented us with some really stimulating information and opinion. And thanks to the organizers and especially to the interpreters over all of those 50 events. So thanks very much indeed. I hope we can do this again, and I'll see you then. In the meantime, take care in the markets, and if you're a processor, start to think about your marketing. Thanks very much indeed, and bye-bye.
a continent thriving with opportunities. 70% of the world's cocoa, 53% of the world's cashew. The resource-rich continent is at a turning point. By 2030, Africa will be home to 20% of the world's population and 75% of people aged under 35. Yet, across the continent, some dynamics persist. The continent continues to export raw natural resources at low cost. Meanwhile, the resilience of its economies is tested by unemployment, poverty, and a global pandemic. Despite the challenges, together we can unlock this potential. At Arise IIP, our vision is to build an African industry. Our ambition is to shift Africa from a global commodity supplier to a global manufacturing powerhouse. We do this by identifying industrial gaps in African countries. We then design tailor-made infrastructure and solutions to enable the sustainable and local transformation of raw materials. In Gabon, where 85% of the land is covered by dense and pristine rainforest, we created from scratch a vibrant local timber industry. It did not happen overnight. We brought together local timber industry players and attracted foreign investors to create a competitive timber processing ecosystem. For this ecosystem to flourish, we attracted foreign investors, establishing linkages across the whole value chain, organizing trade shows for hosted companies to showcase and market their timber products, and boosting exports. GSE's Wood Cluster is now composed of 90 companies operating from the first to the third transformation of timber. All of them transforming ethically and sustainably sourced Gabonese wood. In less than 10 years, Gabon shifted from a net log exporter to the first exporter of veneer in Africa and second in the world. In fact, the real impact was much wider and more meaningful. With GSES, Arise IIP has created 16,000 jobs, attracted 120 investors coming from 18 different countries, operating in 19 industry sectors. In Togo, Benin, and Côte d'Ivoire, our work is underway, following the same approach. Cotton, cashew, soya, cocoa. We enable the transformation of local agricultural products with modern infrastructures and integrated logistics services. By investing in local manufacturing, we ultimately seek to replace foreign imports with domestic production. In all our endeavors, we are driven by the pursuit of green, sustainable growth, one that can last for generations to come. We are the pioneer of a green, responsible industrialization, one that ensures gender diversity, sustainability, traceability, and a zero-waste policy. This is why we create innovative solutions that support a climate-conscious economic development in Africa. This starts with neutralizing carbon emissions and creating a positive environmental legacy. By 2022, all of Arise IIP's industrial zones will be carbon neutral, powered fully by solar technology. This is all made possible by the dedication and commitment of the women and men who work at Arise. Together, we are on a journey to build an African industry, a journey to create a better, more resilient, sustainable, and inclusive future for everyone. Arise IIP, committed to making Africa thrive.
Dans ce contexte actuel de crise sanitaire mondiale liée à la pandémie de la COVID-19, il s'avère fondamental de relever la participation des femmes dans tous les maillons de la production, d'encourager et de renforcer leur leadership et leur résilience pour favoriser leur autonomisation, surtout dans le domaine économique. TechnoServe Bénin et l'Agence territoriale de développement agricole Pôle 4 s'inscrivent activement dans cette dynamique. À cet effet, le 15 et 16 octobre 2020, s'est tenu dans la salle de conférence de l'ATDA Pôle 4 à Parakou une cérémonie de célébration de la Journée internationale de la femme rurale édition 2020. Cette journée a pour objectif de définir les modalités de mise en œuvre d'une stratégie de renforcement du leadership et d'une résilience plus accrue des femmes dans les différentes activités de développement socio-économique.
Dans la plupart des décisions, ces femmes-là ne bénéficient pas des avantages qui sont liés au développement économique de chaque pays. Donc, pour les valoriser davantage, la communauté internationale a dédié la journée du 15 octobre pour les célébrer. Comme nous sommes en partenariat avec des programmes, ils ont décidé de nous accompagner pour pouvoir célébrer l'événement au niveau local. Ces femmes-là sont aussi présentes surtout au niveau du maillon transformation. C'est pourquoi nous leur avons demandé de ne pas venir seulement pour écouter les discours, mais qu'elles viennent avec leur chef-d'œuvre pour qu'on puisse voir ce qu'elles font et les gens vont aussi profiter pour se ravitailler.
En effet, dans sa stratégie de renforcement des capacités des acteurs de la filière cajou, Technoserve, à travers Bénin Cajou, fournit des assistances techniques spécifiques et appropriées à la satisfaction des besoins des partenaires du public et du privé afin de promouvoir la production des noix brutes d'anacarde, le développement des chaînes de valeur et l'amélioration des revenus, notamment ceux des femmes.
Les braves femmes rurales sont effectivement à l'honneur aujourd'hui. Nous les félicitons et nous les exhortons à mettre leur résilience au service de nos communautés, surtout en cette période de pandémie. Et nous voulons les rassurer du soutien de Technoserve pour une plus grande intégration du genre dans les chaînes de valeur de la filière anacarde.
Rappelons qu'au cours de cette messe agricole et rurale de haute facture, diverses autorités ont accompagné la TDA et Technoserve à accélérer les meilleures innovations des produits dérivés du cajou et renforcer les aptitudes des femmes leaders et résilientes dans la filière cajou. Aussi faut-il le souligner, l'ambiance a été motivante et festive, marquée par 2 temps forts, portant notamment sur les réflexions et les partages d'expériences sur la résilience des femmes dans la chaîne de valeur anacarde et l'exposition vente des meilleures innovations réussies en faveur des femmes dans le développement socio-économique.
C'est grâce à Bénin Cajou que ça a été organisé dans le Nord, précisément à Parakou. Et ça a permis aux femmes des 2 Nord de participer. Je veux dire à Takora Donga, Borgo, Albori, Zoukoline, le centre aussi. Voilà pourquoi je tiens à remercier très sincèrement Bénin Cajou. Et cette séance aujourd'hui nous a permis de partager les expériences des autres femmes. C'est déjà un plus pour nous. Et pour nous qui sommes arrivés, je nous demande à notre retour de passer l'information à celles qui ne sont pas venues, pour qu'elles puissent aussi être informées de ce que nous sommes venus faire. C'est ce qui manque souvent. Et ça fait que les informations, nous les gardons, et les autres n'ont plus d'informations aussi. Ça ne permet pas un développement du groupe. Donc je nous demande de souvent communiquer, de partager l'information avec les autres femmes aussi de nos groupes.
Notons que dans la vision de travailler pour une véritable accélération et intégration de la filière cajou au Bénin, avec une part conséquente pour les femmes, l'intégration du genre constitue l'un des principaux axes d'intervention de Technoserve via le projet Bénin Cajou.
Le projet Bénin Cajou a inscrit dans ses priorités, à compter de l'année 2019, des activités pour la sensibilisation des acteurs en vue d'une meilleure prise en compte de l'intégration du genre dans les différents maillons de la production. C'est à ce titre qu'après avoir milité en amont par un plaidoyer auprès de la FENAPAB pour l'amendement des textes en faveur d'une plus grande intégration du genre, Bénin Cajou a soutenu en aval le processus de renouvellement des organes de gestion de la FENAPAB, qui s'est achevé le 23 septembre 2019 avec l'élection à sa tête
d'une fédération nationale des producteurs d'anacarde du Bénin. Les points clés de mes actions sont relatifs à la recherche des partenaires pour améliorer la qualité de nos activités, développer le plaidoyer à l'endroit de l'État pour qu'il nous accompagne.
Mariée et mère de 3 enfants, Madame Saadatou est propriétaire de 5 plantations d'anacardiers de 7 hectares et demi à Pénésoulou dans la commune de Bassila, à 372 km de Cotonou. Entrée dans la production du cajou depuis 1998 et précédemment chef quartier, cette mère